Okay, good morning, everybody. This is, we're resuming our study in Genesis. Our walk through Genesis. We're starting in Genesis chapter 7. I believe that last time we left off at verse 5 or verse 3. So I'm going to back up, as is my tradition, and read a few verses, make a few comments, and then we'll pick up in verse 4. Chapter 7, verse 1 of the book of Genesis. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, two, a male and his female." You remember I noted at the end of our session last time that I noted that this cleanness versus uncleanness had nothing to do with dietary laws, because those dietary laws had not yet been given. Remember that Adam and Eve were created to eat vegetables. No bacon, right? No bacon, no steaks, none of that. They were just straight fruit, and they were salad shooters. They ate nothing but vegetables and fruits and whatever else that the land produced. So prior to the flood, everybody ate vegetables. So, but yet we have God here saying, take of every clean and unclean animal. And the only thing that really makes sense is if you look back and you say, oh, well, this has to do with the sacrificial system, because we see that it will, eventually you'll see that if you get to Genesis chapter 9, is it chapter 9 or chapter 10? Genesis chapter 9, no, the end of Genesis chapter 8, right before 9, that Noah offers up a sacrifice, and the sacrifice would involve the slaying of clean animals as opposed to the unclean animals. So it's all about the sacrificial system and the sacrifices that the Lord would honor as being worthy. So clean and unclean animals has nothing to do with eating. It has everything to do with the worship of Yahweh. Verse 3, also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of all the earth. For after 7 more days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. Noah did according to all that Yahweh had commanded him. Now Noah was 600 years old when the floodwater came upon the earth. Okay, let's pause there for a second. So here you've got, if you back up a little bit, you remember that in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, God said that his word says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took, no, sorry, that's the wrong verse. Verse 3, I had a blonde moment there, sorry, I started reading in verse 2. Then Yahweh said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh, nevertheless his days shall be 120 years. So when we looked at this passage, we said, this is not how long man's lifespan is going to be. This is how long man has left on the earth before the flood comes. Like, it's the clock that's counting down to judgment. So God says, okay, 120 years, and it's on like Donkey Kong. So after 120 years, God says, during this time, God says, okay, you're going to build this ark. You and your sons are going to build this ark. So how long did it take? You remember from last week, I posted a link in the chat and you know what? I totally forgot to put that in the notes on the YouTube channel, on the YouTube video. So I need to make a note to myself to go put that in there. Spirit shall not strive with man forever. This is the countdown to the flood, and then we get down to, so we're talking about Bodhi Hodge's his article where he breaks down how long he thinks it took Noah and his sons to build the ark, and I think he came down to right around 55 to 75 years. So it's a pretty good read. So 55 to 75 years, they're building the ark, they're making all these preparations, and then we come down to the actual event. And then God says in chapter 7, verse 1, it says, "Enter the ark, you and all your household." All right, so get on in. So they've spent 55, 65, 70 years, whatever. They spent a number of decades building this boat. And then God says, get on in there And then he says in verse 4, for after 7 more days, I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. So you have to ask yourself, okay, they've spent several decades building this boat. And then God says, get in, because after 7 more days, I'm sending the water. So why would God have them wait for 7 more days? They've already spent 5, 6, 7 decades building this thing. Now get on there and wait for 7 days. Pastor Hutch used to have this saying. I don't know if he ever said it in church, but he said it in discipleship group. He said, you know the only thing that smells worse than a sheep? 2 sheep. And there were at least 7 on the ark. So you got to know that it had to be smelly. They were in a zoo in a box. I mean, zoos are not exactly, they don't exactly smell pleasant when they're outdoors. And then you put all that animal aroma, and you got, giraffes and zebras and everything else passing gas in this big old box. And there they are for 7 days sniffing animal flatulence, right? So why in the world would God have them get on the ark? And they're going to be on the ark, as we'll see, they're going to be on the ark for, I think it's about 370 days, for a full year. But no, get on 7 days early and just sit there. Well, what's going on with this? What do you suppose Noah and his family were doing for 7 whole days? Well, the Bible doesn't say explicitly, but I think when we look to, was it 2 Peter 2:5? Flip over there real quick. I think we get an idea of what Noah was probably doing. Who's next is James, 1st and 2nd Peter. Okay. All right, 1 Peter, 2 Peter 2:5. Let's start in verse 4. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to pits of darkness, reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. And the sentence goes on. But the thing I want to call out here is it calls Noah a what? A preacher of righteousness. So what do you suppose that God, or that Noah was doing for those final 7 days?
Asking people to get on.
Asking them? Oh, please get on.
Are we not asking, but encouraging them to repent and
Strongly encouraging them to get on. It's like, hey, he was a preacher of righteousness, right? He was calling, I kind of see Noah as kind of like a forerunner of John the Baptist, right? Repent, for the kingdom, the God's judgment is coming near. Repent, get on this boat. This is the only way to be saved. And the more you look at the ark, the more you see that it's like, hey, this is a picture of Jesus Christ, right? So here's God's coming judgment. The only way to be saved from God's coming judgment in the Noahic flood was to do what? Was to get on the boat. But the only way to get on the boat was through what? Through the one door. There was one door on the side of the boat. Well, this is interesting, right? Jesus says, I am the door, right? And Jesus also said that no one comes to the Father but by me. There's only one way to get onto the boat. Nobody was allowed to throw up a grappling hook and climb over the walls and become a stowaway on the ark. They were all invited. They were all encouraged, if you will, to get on the boat, to walk up the ramp, to get on the boat. It was the only means to save the people of that day from the judgment of God that was to come. That is the same way it is with Jesus Christ. The ark is a picture of who Jesus Christ is. And you remember, I think I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, that the ark was covered with pitch. And if I remember correctly, the word that's used there for pitch, or the covering, is the same word that's used for atonement. So Jesus provides this atoning sacrificial cover to cover, it keeps the sin, the judgment of God, which is around the ark, from seeping into the ark, right? So the blood of Christ covers you, it atones you, it keeps the judgment of God off of you, essentially is what's going on. So here we got Noah and his family, Noah and 7 others, and a whole bunch of animals. God says, after 7 more days, I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. There's something else that I think that Noah and his family were doing for those 7 days. And this goes back to my study of Genesis chapter 5. I talk about this at some length in my presentation, Wherefore Art the Begats. You remember, if you take the genealogy in Genesis chapter 5 and you plot it out, you discover something really interesting about the lifespan of Methuselah. Methuselah died the year that the flood started. Now, the Bible doesn't say this explicitly, but I think when you look at the entire picture, you can construct a narrative that fits with the biblical narrative. It's certainly not contradictory to it. There may be a better explanation for it. But I think what happened here is that Methuselah, whose name, some argue means after him it shall come, or after him it is sent. I think what happened was that Methuselah died, and then God in his mercy allowed for a 7-day mourning period to mourn the loss of Noah's grandfather. Now, again, that's me reading into the text a little bit, but I am wide open to other explanations for that. But I haven't heard one that really kind of ties it all together. So Noah is told to get on the ark. God says, after 7 more days, I will send rain upon the earth. I think he was a preacher of righteousness. So I think he was preaching, encouraging the people of his day to get on the boat to escape God's wrath. And he was also mourning the loss of his grandfather, who lived for 969 years. So verse 5, chapter 7, Noah did according to all that Yahweh had commanded him. Now Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water came upon the earth. So here's what I like to do. Whenever I see, when I see dates like this mentioned, and as you continue to read through the flood narrative, you see that God gives you a number of different little milestones. Like after so many days, this happened. After so many days, this happened. When Noah was such and such in this month and this day of Noah's life, you can he gives you little mileposts. And when you put these all together, you can construct an actual timeline for the flood to figure out how long they were actually on the ark and roughly when things happened. And I'm going to make reference to that as we get a little bit deeper into this. So what I like to do is I like to write down Noah was 600 years old when the floodwater came upon the earth. So we'll call that year 600 because everything's based upon Noah's lifespan, the timeline that we're going to construct here. It says, then Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood, of clean animals and animals that are not clean, and birds of everything that creeps on the ground. There went into the ark to Noah by twos, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. So of all the unclean animals, they went in, male and a female. And you can reckon the clean animals. They're supposed to take 7 of every clean animal. But I think when you tie that was in verse 2. But when you tie that down here to where it says in verse 9, there went into the ark to Noah by twos, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. I think what when you put these 2 verses together, I think what the clean animals were 14 in number. So a male and its female, so 7 pairs, not just 7 animals. Because otherwise it would be kind of difficult. It would be impossible to have 7 clean animals, each with a male and a female, right? So the 7 is not equally divisible by 2. All right, so of clean animals and animals that are not clean and birds and everything that creeps on the ground, there went into the ark by Noah twos, male and a female, as God had commanded Noah. It came about after the 7 days that the water of the flood came upon the earth. So it's interesting that there was only one way to get on the ark. The ark was the only way to be saved, and it was God himself who shut up the ark, who closed the door. So it's interesting that man doesn't decide when the flood starts. Man doesn't decide when the judgment comes. Man doesn't decide how to get on the ark. Man doesn't decide when that door is closed. It was all God's doing. So in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So when you see the 600th year of Noah's life in the second month and in the 17th day of the month, what I do is I write down February 17, 600. Now, obviously the Jews did not use months as we did. They probably, in all likelihood, used a 360-day calendar, not a 365-day calendar. And so, like most ancient Semitic peoples, they used the lunar calendar, 360 days a year. And then every few years, they had to add another month in there. The Jews called it Adar 2, I believe is the name they used for their intercalculary month, I think is the name for it. So every few years, to make up for the loss of days, because the year is actually 365 days and they're counting 360. So every 6 or 7 years, they had to add another month to kind of make up for the offset. So I write down February 17th, 600. That was basically the second month of Noah's life. On the 17th day of the month, when Noah was 600 years old, that's when the flood started. And so where did the water come from? Well, we see here that it says in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open and the floodgates of the sky were opened. So the water came not only from the rain, the water came from underground, the fountains of the great deep. And if you remember from what was it, physical science that we all had in like junior high school, the water cycle involves you have the oceans and lakes and whatnot, and there's evaporation, and then the water collects in the clouds and becomes saturated, and then the rain falls. So in order to accelerate, if you accelerate the cycle somehow, then you can get massive amounts of rainfall. Like if you accelerate the evaporation, then you get more cloud cover, and then you get more rain. And so you just got this vicious cycle going on. So how do you get this incredible cycle? How do you accelerate all this? There have been a number of different models that have been proposed. One of them involves involving catastrophic plate tectonics. So you remember the Earth appears to, on its surface, appears to consist of various different plates, and the plates are constantly moving. So you have plates that, let's see, looking at it like this, you have plates that move against each other like this. And what happens is you get tension that's built up on these plates, and when it finally goes like that, you get an earthquake. You also have subduction zones where one plate will dive underneath another. And you also have areas where two plates collide, and rather than diving and rather than sliding against each other, what will happen is the two plates will push up like this, and then you get giant mountain ranges. This is how we think the Himalayan mountain range, for example, when you have the Eurasian plate, the Australian plate and the Asian plate colliding, and it causes this great big mountain range to form. And as a matter of fact, the Mount Everest, I think, grows at a rate of 2.4 inches per year, if I remember correctly. So these plates are still moving towards one another, and they're pushing the mountains up. And so when you have plates that's when plates are sliding against each other. Plates can subduct, plates can go like that, they can buckle, but plates can also separate. And when you separate, you expose what's underneath. And what's underneath the hot plates? Well, there's a layer of magma. And magma, of course, is very hot. Yeah?
Dan?
Yeah.
So with the idea of like Pangea, like how all the different continents used to be together, do you think the flood could have caused that, like the division that we see between
yeah, absolutely. I don't know if the flood caused it. I think what God did was he broke up the surface of the earth, and that's what precipitated the flood. So I'm not sure. I think the cause and effect relationship might be reversed, right? So God, ultimately is the ultimate cause of this thing. But I think what happened was he broke up the surface of the land and exposed the magma underneath, which would have superheated the oceans, which would have caused rapid evaporation, cloud cover, and then rain, right? And so if you've got this cycle going on, then you get rapidly accelerated water, the water cycle. So lots and lots of rain. But there's a lot of water trapped underneath the ground as well. They're, you know, giant underground springs and whatever. So when you have to be careful. Somebody says, well, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Well, you can't get enough rain out of the clouds. You know, the atmosphere won't hold that much water to flood the entire earth to cover all the mountains. There's a video I did called, what did I call it? Oh, Dissecting the Math of the Great Flood. It's available on my YouTube channel. And in it, I dissect a video that's entitled the Math of the Great Flood, where a skeptic goes through and he shows that Noah's flood is completely unscientific. It could never have happened because the people who came up with the story clearly did not do the math. And I walk through his video and show from the Bible why he's made a number of false assumptions, and his argument just totally falls apart. So it's if you get a few minutes, watch that video. It's called Dissecting the Math of the Great Flood. The thumbnail says Crouching Skeptic, Hidden Assumptions is in the thumbnail. So anyway, moving along. So you write down February 17th, 600. So you can kind of put like a concrete date on this thing so you can get a sense of, you know, how long everything took to happen. All right, so the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and for 40 nights, but that wasn't the only source of the water. The water came from underneath the ground. All right, verse 13. On the very same day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japheth, the sons of Noah, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons with them entered the ark. They and every beast after its kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, all sorts of birds. So they went into the ark, into Noah, by twos of all flesh, in which was the breath of life. Notice it says they went into, right? Noah didn't have to go out and capture them. I talked about that last week. It says those that entered, male and female of all flesh, entered as God had commanded him, and Yahweh closed it behind him. Again, I got a little ahead of myself a few minutes ago, but God closed the door, right? So God decides how we're saved. He decides when the judgment comes, and he decides, you know, when the door is closed, right? When your opportunity is over. It wasn't Noah sealing people out, so it's not Noah's fault that the people on the outside died. If you want to place blame, blame God, right? Because he's the one who sealed the door. Then the flood of water came upon the earth for 40 days, and the water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. The water prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Now I want to pause here. You notice I put particular emphasis on this, because there are some who would say that the Noah's flood was a local event. It was not a worldwide event. It covered all the earth, as in like all the region where people lived. But we've seen a number of clues so far that would militate against that, because God repeatedly says under the whole heavens, and he talks about all animals and all life and all flesh, right? So it's not even talking about all mankind, he's talking about all the animals. So unless you're willing to argue that the animals only stayed where the humans were and they never ventured outside of that, which I think is really unreasonable, then you can't say that it was a localized event. Additionally, if they knew the flood was coming and you see the waters rising, then if it was just a localized event, let's just say, it kind of filled in some kind of a valley or a basin where people lived, all the animals and the people would have to do would be to climb over the mountains and get over to the other side, and then go over there and say, "Ha ha, God, you missed me," right? Escaping God's judgment would be possible, but God says no. Every living thing that has breath in its lungs will die. It's all going to be wiped out except for what's on the ark. And then looking forward to Christ, if the ark is truly a picture of who Jesus Christ is, then there would be some way to escape God's judgment other than getting on the boat, other than latching onto Jesus and trusting him for in our with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength for our salvation. it doesn't, the whole illustration, the prototype, the type and shadow of Christ in the ark completely falls apart when you say, oh, it was a localized event, it wasn't global in nature. But there's more, right? What do we know about water? Water seeks its own level. So if I have here, let's see, hold up a book here, and we'll call this my mountain. And then I have over here a bunch of water that's rising up. So what you'd have to say is, okay, the water would only go so high, right? Because otherwise, if the water goes any higher, what's going to happen to it? Well, it's going to spill over here. But God's word doesn't say that the water just went to the tops of the mountains and it filled up a basin. Sorry, I got to keep my elbows off the table so I'm not jiggling the camera. It says the water prevailed. Look at chapter 7, verse 20. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, so that's roughly 22 feet, and the mountains were covered. So what happens? It says, well, not only did the water reach this level, it went 15 feet higher, and it covered the mountains. So if you're going to say the flood was a localized event, now again, we don't know how big the mountains were. We don't know if it was a little peak like this, or if it was a gigantic peak like this. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter how high the mountains were, because what happens is when it says the water reached the tops of the mountains, and then it went 22 feet higher, 15 cubits, 22 feet higher, and then it says it covered. Well, if you're going to say that, well, we know that water seeks its own level, right? So the water comes to the top of the mountain, flows to the other side, and then it starts to fill up over here. In order to cover the mountains, and because we know that water seeks its own level, you're going to have a situation that's like this. There's nowhere to escape this water. So some people have said, basically, if you're going to say that the flood was a localized event, it only covered where the part where people live, then what you're going to have to argue is that basically the water rose up 22 feet over the top of the mountain and then just kind of gelled and kind of stood there. But if that were the case, then first of all, you have water acting very unnaturally, which I guess is not impossible, because we saw that in water acting unnaturally in Exodus, right? When Israel crossed the Red Sea, Moses held out his staff and the Red Sea parted, and what does it say? The water kind of basically walled up on either side and kind of acted like jello. Imagine how trippy that would have been. Fish is swimming along, and then he comes up and he's like, whoa, this is weird. The fish are like, those are the weirdest looking, watching the people walk across or, run across. Those are some weird looking fish. So water has been known to act unnaturally, but we see no indication in the text here that such a thing happened. As a matter of fact, it seems to indicate that was not the case, because if the water rose up and gelled and walled like it did in Exodus, and then like it did later on when the Israelites were crossing the Jordan River, then the mountain wouldn't really be covered, right? It would just be kind of walled up there. So that militates against that. And it says, furthermore, it says, the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens. Well, again, we talked about this maybe a week or two ago. There are 3 heavens that are spoken of in the scriptures. You have the earth. The first heaven is the atmosphere around the earth. And then the second heaven would be outer space. And the third heaven would be God's throne room, presumably in another dimension. It's outside of the physical world. So we have 3 heavens, and the earth is in the middle of this. It's kind of like a big Tootsie Pop drop, right? Imagine, you got the earth as the Tootsie Roll center, and then you've got the atmosphere, the heavens that are wrapped around the earth. Now, this says nothing about whether the earth is in the center of all this, the absolute center. The point is that the earth is completely surrounded by the heavens, regardless of where you put earth precisely in that set of concentric spheres, if you will. So it says everywhere under the heavens. Well, where are the heavens? There's nowhere you can go on the earth where you are not under the heavens, right? It's all inclusive. You cannot get away from being under the heavens. Even if you dig yourself a hole and you go underground, you go into a coal mine, ultimately you're still under the heavens, because the heavens are over the earth and the earth is then over you. So you can't get away from it. Everywhere, all the high mountains, everywhere under the heavens were covered. This was clearly a global event. It was not a localized flood. You can't get a localized flood from the biblical text. You just can't. Verse 20, the water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. So it says that the mountains are covered twice. It's almost like God's trying to emphasize this. I think maybe he saw us coming with our brilliant ideas, like, oh no, it's just a localized event. And it's almost like God saying, yeah, I know these jokers aren't going to get it. So I'll say it twice in 2 consecutive verses, just so you'll know that I'm serious about this. Everywhere under the whole heavens, they're covered. And then he starts up in verse 21 and he kind of lays it on even thicker. All flesh that moved on the earth perished. All. I mean, even in Hebrew, all means all. You can't get out of it. Here's all the flesh, right? You imagine the screen is the field of a giant Venn diagram, right? So here you got all the animals, and which of them died? All of them. There's no escape. There's no part of the circle, including the animals, that is outside of the circle of God's judgment, the set of animals that are going to die. Oh, all the water prevailed. Let's see, all flesh that moved on the earth perished. All of them, birds and cattle and beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all mankind. All. It's, I just imagine God kind of like a blacksmith, just beating on this piece of hot metal, like all. There's no equivocation on this. Verse 22, of all that was on the dry land, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life died. And thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. The water prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Whew. I get excited about this. All right, chapter 8. But God remembered Noah and the beasts and the cattle that were with him in the ark, and God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water subsided. Now, where did all the water go? This is one of the things that I covered in my video, Dissecting the Math of the Great Flood. The guys, there's some people have said, well, God miraculously caused the waters to rise, and so God miraculously caused the waters to rebate. Or maybe God used a giant soda straw and blew it off into outer space. Like, where did all the water go? We're talking about a phenomenal amount of water, but which is clearly no longer on the planet, because otherwise we would be flooded, right? Well, not so fast. Hold your finger here and turn to the book of Psalms. Take a look at Psalm 104. Look at, we're going to look for verses 5 through 9. Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9. He established the earth upon its foundations, so that it would not totter forever and ever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. Sound familiar? At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they hurried away. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they would not return to cover the earth. Now note something here. Some have said, trying to explain their way out of this and saying, well, this is talking about the initial creation. Because remember, in Genesis 1:1 to 1:3, the earth was originally without form and it was void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the deep. The earth, and Peter tells us that the earth was created out of water and by water. So the earth started off as a gigantic ball of water. And then from that, God created the dry land and everything that we see. So this cannot be used. You cannot say that Psalm 104 verses 6 through 9 are talking about the initial creation, because when you get to verse 9, it says, you set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. So return means that it was covered and now it's not, and then it would come back again, right? Well, if this is describing the initial creation, then God's word was violated with the Noahic flood. You get that? If this is creation, because the earth started off covered by water and then God brought the dry land out of it, if this can't be creation, because he says they will not return to, the waters will not return to cover the earth. So if this is talking about creation, God's word is violated. He's essentially been found to be a liar about not destroying the earth with water. This is clearly talking about the Noahic flood and what happened at the end of it. The water, the earth started off with water, land came up. So remember, when the earth was originally covered with water, there was no dry land. There were no mountains to be covered, because the dry land didn't appear till what? Till day 3, right? So there were no mountains when the earth was originally covered. So we get to this, and then we see also, take a look at verse 8. It says, the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. So now think about this. The earth itself, when you look at it on a kind of a micro level, as opposed to, way out in outer space, way out in outer space, it looks like pretty much just a ball hanging there, a perfect sphere. But when you get closer in, you see that the earth is not a perfect sphere. It is not smooth. It is not a smooth marble. It is very jagged. We have mountain peaks, as I've already discussed. We've got hills and we've got valleys. And then when you get out into the oceans, like you go out to the Marianas Trench, out in the Pacific Ocean, it's the deepest spot that we know of in the ocean. And it's, you could fit several Mount Everests in the Marianas Trench. I mean, it's incredibly deep volume, deep water. So we know that water seeks its own level. So what happened? Where did all the water from the flood go? Well, I would submit to you that it's still out there in the oceans. So what does the Psalm tell us? Psalm says that the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so they will not return to cover the earth, the waters. What happens if you imagine you have a vessel filled with water, and the bottom of the vessel has an elastic bottom to it, and you could take your fist and you could push it up through the bottom, so simulating a mountain rising up. Where do you suppose the water in that vessel is going to go? It's going to flow over the sides, right? Because as you push your fist into the water, or even in your sink, right? If you take your sink and you fill it up with water, don't try this at home, kids. Do this outside in a bucket. But if you take your sink and you fill it up, and then you take a ball, like a basketball, and you push it into the sink, what's going to happen? Well, the water's going to go running all over the floor. This is why you don't do this at home. Do it outside in a bucket. And then, so the water gets displaced. So it says the mountains rose up, which would have displaced water. Okay, that's fine, but then where's the water going to go? It says the valleys also sank down. So you get trenches and valleys all around the world, or in the ocean basins, and that's where the water would go. So if you were to take the earth, and you take all the mountains and you squish them down, and you take all the valleys in the ocean, in the ocean basins and whatnot, and fill them up, and if you were to make the land mass of Earth, both underwater and exposed, if you were to make the Earth a perfectly smooth ball, do you know how deep the water would be that would cover the Earth with the existing water in the oceans today? You've got enough water in the oceans. If you were to do that, squish down the mountains, fill in the valleys, the water would reach a depth of about 2 miles. That's how much water we have on the surface of our planet. I talk about this in my book. It's in my, I've got footnotes. Also, the presentation, Dissecting the Math of the Great Flood, I talk about this as well. And I show you exactly, I show you a little bit better than, rather than hand wavy motions, I've got actual graphics where I show you, how this works and the depth of the water that would cover the earth. So we've got enough water in our oceans today to cover the earth to a depth of about 2 miles. So how do you get rid of all that water from Noah's flood? I think it's still here. There's no need for God to break up the cosmic soda straw and, suck it up in his mouth and spit it off into outer space somewhere, or just drink it. There's no need for that. Because all the water is still there. The water in the oceans, you go out to the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, wherever you happen to be, all that water should be a constant reminder to you of God's judgment, right? As well as the valleys, things like the Grand Canyon, the scablands out in eastern Washington. All these things should be reminders to us as we drive over them, drive through them, or fly over them, that we see the scars that are left on the face of the earth as a result of God's judgment upon man for his sin. So where did all the water go? It's still out there. Mountains rose up, valleys rose down, and that's where the water went. So back to Genesis chapter 8. So verse 3 says, and the water receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the water decreased. In the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, hey, July 17th, my birthday. So in July 17, when Noah was 600 years old, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. Now, there is a mountain range in eastern Turkey. There's a mountain called Ararat, and some people think, well, this is where the ark is. But notice it says the mountains of Ararat. So apparently Ararat was a region, not just a mountain, and several people have claimed to have seen things out there. The Turkish government isn't really big on letting people go out there looking for biblical artifacts. So it's really hard to get in there and do exploration. Some people claim to have found something that looks like Noah's Ark. I don't think it's been conclusively proven one way or the other. I'm skeptical of such claims. I don't think that it's terribly reasonable, though not impossible. I don't think it's terribly reasonable. It doesn't seem reasonable to me to think that the wood of the ark would survive several thousand years of freeze thaw and weather and all that. I think the timbers have most likely rotted away, assuming that Noah and his family didn't actually use those timbers for other purposes. Reclaimed lumber, right? It's all the rage now, and it probably started back then. So they may have reused the wood. A lot of it probably rotted away. I don't think we'll ever find the ark. Because I think God knows what happens when we find things that are biblical significance, artifacts. What do we tend to do? Well, we tend to worship them, right? It goes all the way back to the Israelites, right? The bronze serpent that Moses held up in the desert, so that when people were bitten by the snakes, which were God's judgment, all they had to do was look upon the serpent and they would be cured, they would be healed. Well, what did the people start to do? Well, they started to worship the bronze serpent, and eventually they had to grind it up into powder and destroy the bronze serpent, because people were worshiping the created thing rather than the creator, rather than the one that the serpent represented. So it was, God knows what happens when we get artifacts. And, I've heard it said, there are people who are running around saying, well, I've got a piece of the cross. Well, I've heard it said that if you took all the splinters that supposedly came from Jesus' cross, and you put them all together, you'd probably have enough wood to build Noah's Ark, right? So that was either one gigantic cross, or we in our superstition are just so eager to grasp onto some kind of piece of physical evidence of what God has done that we'll just latch onto anything. So we're all we like sheep have gone astray. Sheep are not smart animals, folks. But that's what the Bible calls us over and over and over again. So we are highly prone to straying off and to worshiping the creature rather than the creator. All right, so July 17th, in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark rested on the mountains of Ararat. So somewhere probably over there in eastern Turkey is where the ark finally came to rest. And the water decreased steadily until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, so looking at October 1st by our calendar, the tops of the mountains became visible. So now you got the little, it's like, hey, wait a minute, there's a mountain peak over there. Check it out. Then it came about at the end of 40 days that Noah opened the window of the ark which he had made, and he sent out a raven, and it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. And he sent out a dove from him to see if the water was abated from the face of the land. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot, so she returned to him into the ark, for the water was on the surface of all the earth. And then he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark to himself. Now we're going to wrap it up right there. Stop here in verse 9 because my bedroom door just opened. I think people are looking at me saying, Daddy, we need to get going. So let's wrap this up, and we'll pick it up, Lord willing, next week in Genesis chapter 8, verse 10.